Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney podcast. Wherever you are on the property ladder, you've probably thought, hey, there's others there who already own the good properties. You drive down the streets and think maybe I'd like that one. Others got in years beforehand. I guess it's a bit like playing Monopoly, and others have got all the good properties on the Monopoly board. And in many cases, they're the baby boomers. They won the property game because they got in the market a long time ago. So is there still hope for the younger generations below them, the Gen Zs, the Gen X, the Gen Y? And the answer is yes, you can fight back and you can win the game of Monopoly. And that's what we discuss in today's episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, where I want to give you some clarity about how to take advantage of this new phase of the property cycle that's we're experiencing at the moment. Today's show's a little bit different. It's episode of the Demographics Decoded podcast that I run once a week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. But because this was such a popular episode we ran a short while ago, I'm sharing it with the wider audience of the Michael Yardney podcast. And we're going to talk a bit about the generational wealth disparities, focusing on some of the advantages the baby boomers had over the younger generations. But don't worry where you are in the ladder of property, or if you're not on the property ladder yet, we're going to give you some advice. So once again, thanks for joining us this week on the Michael Yardney podcast. Let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Now, if you've ever felt like you're playing a game of property monopoly in Australia at the moment, but somebody else has gone past go decades before you and now owns half the monopoly board, you're probably not imagining it. That someone else, of course, is the baby boomers. And I've got to admit, I'm a baby boomer and I bought my first property well over 50 years ago. And many baby boomers seem to have won the game of property in Australia. And it's not just because they got in early like me, but because the rules of the game have changed. They've made it increasingly more difficult at the expense of younger generations. So, Simon, today I'd like to have a bit of a chat about whether baby boomers really did have it any easier or not. It didn't seem easy to me at the time, as well as how younger generations could catch up and build their own property wealth. So let's have a look at really where we stand at the moment.
Well, first and foremost, the facts that you mentioned, they are actually true. So the Hilda survey, it's a big famous survey in Australia. It's the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey. I'm pretty sure they kind of forced the acronym in there. But so that really shows how wealth is distributed. And it shows quite clearly
that's a serial survey that follows people over a long period of time and how their things change. So I'll leave a link in the show notes because it's got some very interesting information, hasn't it?
It is great reading for the data literate population out there, because it does show longitudinal data. You can compare generations with one another, and that is, it's fascinating read. And essentially you see that older Australians, or the share of wealth that older Australians hold, has increased over the last 20 odd years, which means that increasingly we need to adjust our stereotypes of the penny pinching pensioner. We now have a wealthy cohort retiring, so that does change the game a little bit. The astonishing fact is that households headed by baby boomers own 54% of all dwellings, even though they just make up 26% of the households. So they essentially overrepresented by a factor of 100%, which is astonishing. So fair enough, that happened. They are about twice as wealthy as millennials on average, just over $1 million compared to just over $500,000 for millennials, which again partially is to be expected, because ideally if you manage your finances well, you get richer year after year. If you also live in the right time of history. But to be that much richer, that is actually quite surprising.
Baby boomers have also dramatically reduced their debt. And I guess that's a factor of time as well, isn't it, Simon? While younger households, they're more leveraged than ever before.
Yes, absolutely. And the reason younger households have more debt has to do with things that we now have more younger households that are university educated. And all of a sudden, university education isn't free and you carry a HECS debt, a uni debt with you. So that means you first got to get this debt out of the way before you're debt free. And of course, you at some point have a mortgage that adds to the debt, as that's challenging. And of course, general costs of living has gone up. So if rents make up a higher proportion of your income, then it is harder to create a bit of a nest egg besides that as well. And we even have more random costs associated with households. Cell phones. Now everyone carries thousands of dollars worth of cell phones and very expensive mobile phone contracts with them. That wasn't the case beforehand. So there is a new cost that you now have to carry. It provides lots of wonderful benefits, but it is a cost to a household. So you have younger households that have more debt than baby boomers would have had, and that of course feeds into the wealth equation. That said, all those wealth figures in Australia always take into account superannuation as well. And that is something that other countries don't have, because here your retirement savings, they are your own. And whereas in a country like Germany, you wouldn't count your retirement savings because you have pension rights that are in one big bucket, and this big bucket isn't counted into your wealth. So in a sense, when you hear Australians are the richest people or are super wealthy people, I'd say, now, well, don't be too sure about what this actually means. Don't be too proud about this, because your pension pays into it, and of course your outrageously expensive house feeds into it. And in a sense, your housing wealth is empty calories, because you can't just easily liquidate it and use it for shenanigans.
Look, going back to the initial monopoly, I can't even say it, analogy I gave, I guess the baby boomers did pass go more often. They collected their $200, I guess a lot more, and they did buy up in many places the Mayfairs and the Park Lanes. And so a lot of Australians are thinking now they're stuck with old Kent Road. But I know that as a baby boomer, we in general did work hard. We did live frugally. We did take risks, but we also had a tailwind. In the 70s and 80s, when I first started buying properties, when I bought my first home, the average home cost 3 to 4 times the average annual income. And today it's over 9 times. Now that's an example that's often used, Simon. I don't think it's fair or right that beginners in the market believe they should be able to buy a median home the first for them. A lot of beginners want to buy the sort of home it took their parents 30, 40 years to live, to be able to afford. But having said that, it was relatively cheaper to get into the housing market. So
absolutely. And this is where finally all of those demographic elements feed into as well, the standard demographics. Baby boomers probably started their families in the early to mid 20s. So we now do this a decade later. And doing this a decade later means you are more advanced in your life, means the first house must be bigger. You change your expectations in life, and you compare yourself to your baby boomer parents who were just wealthy and who brought you up in a big house. And so you feel that not getting the big house is a bit of a disappointment, because you expected to live at least as well as your parents. So that is quite dramatic. It's just the simple fact that you do things later in life that make things harder as well. And of course, we now pretty much, if you put yourself in the shoes of a millennial buying a house now, they have the exact same cities to choose from than baby boomers, but those cities are now more populated. Is harder to find. Of course, the land prices go up. The construction industry hasn't been doing any major advancements to make building costs go down. Building costs are more expensive now than they were in the past, because we built better houses with better materials, and we didn't add robotics or anything to the mix at any meaningful scale. So that means you just buy roughly the same, you actually buy a worse product, a smaller dwelling on a smaller piece of land, or a bigger dwelling on a smaller piece of land, and you pay more money for it.
I disagree that it's a worse product, because when I grew up, basically there were 3, my sister, myself and my parents, 2 generations, and for the first half of my childhood life, 3 generations living in a much smaller home. So the bathroom, the toilet was outside, there wasn't necessarily a laundry, we didn't have a media room, we didn't have study, we did have a bigger block of land in many ways. So I think the expectation of how we want to live has changed. Of course, that's progress. That's one of the benefits of living in the best country in the world and the best time at history. I think baby boomers also had the benefit of a number of significant booms. In the 70s, there was massive inflation and property values doubled in 6 or 7 years as they did in the 80s and again at some stage in the early 90s. So we've had property values doubling and tripling in some areas, increasing even tenfold. I think one of the other benefits my generation had was that we had free education, university, tertiary education. We didn't have a HECS debt. But at the same time, Simon, it was harder initially to get a loan from the bank because they didn't take into account your wife's income in the early years, even though a lot of couples had both parties working.
Yeah, we discussed this in the baby boomer generational podcast, that baby boomers were destined to be poor as a generation because there were so many of them. 3.8 kids per woman at the height. So 18 years later, all of those kids enter the workplace at the same time. This creates downwards wage pressures. And so it was meant to be a relatively poor generation. But boomers did throw women at the workforce at scale for the first time. Before that, that wasn't a thing. And so under baby boomers, Australian households went from one household income to 1.5 household incomes. And so all of a sudden you have this turbocharged spending capacity. And yes, this wasn't accounted into the mortgages, but ultimately more money was floating around. So baby boomers could benefit from this. And baby boomers did use this additional money to buy cars. And that opened up the cities. Before that, you had to travel by tram, by bicycle, by whatever, by bus. And now you had cars available for even moderate families. And so you could then drive outwards and you open up suburbia. You can only do this so far. Our cities are now gigantic beasts, and millennials, yes, you can move to Melton, to Western Sydney. Something like this is still possible, but only so far because you still need to get to the CBD. So we essentially maxed that out, and we did not create new cities since then, where we set completely new settlements that we start from scratch. So that would have lowered house prices theoretically downwards, and that did not occur. So again, upwards price pressure.
I remember well now, as you mentioned it, that when my first wife and I had kids, we moved to one of the outer suburbs, but the freeways were they were free, firstly, no tolls, and number two, it was a quick, fast, easy run there, but land was cheap and houses were not as expensive, and so you lived in a very different environment to what younger generations need to or want to live today. But I guess, as you said, and you mentioned it a moment ago, we did a series on the different generations. If you're new to this podcast and you haven't listened to Simon and my series for each of the generations, wherever you're listening to this, once you've listened to today's show, go back and listen to previous or watch previous shows regarding the different generations, because you'll understand why you and how you think differently to people older than you and younger than you. And that's very relevant in business, in work, in investments, to understand what's required. This current, how we're currently living, Simon, is the next generation having their babies later. So when I was young, if you weren't married in your middle 20s, there was an expression used, you're left on the shelf. I don't think one says that anymore. In fact, people are having gap years. Who knew about a gap year when I was young? And they're taking their time to settle into a career. They're staying at universities longer. They're getting married later, they're having families later, and they're buying their first home later. I guess that keeps them renting in the property market for much longer too.
Exactly. So all of those cultural behavior shifts have a housing angle to it. They have an angle that makes it harder to get the house. All the while, we increase expectations. So you know this, and while you're young, you can toughen it out. You can easily sleep on the ground. Camping is not an issue. The older you get, the harder the mattress feels on the campground. And so you move up market as you get older. You move to a bit more comfort. And so yeah, we have all of a sudden we have young parents that are not that young. That are in their mid to late 30s. And of course, then you have the expectation, the cultural expectation that we created over time, that you need to have a bedroom for each kid. So all of a sudden, kid family, pretty much the norm still, needs one bedroom for mom and dad, one for each kid. That's 3 bedrooms. Maybe you're a knowledge worker. That means you have a study to work from home quite a bit. So you need 4 bedrooms. And that is quite expensive. And where are those homes available? Who can afford this? So that's quite rough, the change in the expectation. And you can't just say, young people change their expectations. That's not how that works. If an expectation is in the system, it is in the system, and you need to live with it. And one option is that you are disappointed by not getting your wishes, so to speak. And that is politically difficult for a country. If you have a big number of your voting population being disappointed, that's not helpful, because ultimately this means that they think that the system is working against them. And if you think that the system is working against you, sooner or later you will question the system. And in our case, this does mean questioning democracy. And so we want not all that many people questioning the concept of democracy. That's a pretty cool thing in my book, that we live in a free democratic country, and I want to protect this. And making housing unaffordable for the desires of the young people is ultimately putting democracy at risk. I'm not saying it leads to dictatorship or something, but I'm saying it puts it at risk rather than strengthening it.
We agree with that. So I'm not suggesting that, I agree, I guess in some ways I've been lucky. I'm not suggesting that poor millennials should just put up with their lot. I think it's terrible that in our country we're not giving them the opportunity to get into the market. There's always going to be the disenfranchised people, and that's where social housing takes a place. We're not talking about them, and there's not enough social housing. That's talk for a totally different discussion. But millennials are having trouble getting in the market. And then there's the ones in between that are sometimes called the sandwich generation. Generation X is those in their 40s and 50s. They're squeezed in the middle. They're trying to pay off their home. Others are helping their kids get into the market, and others are worried about their parents getting old or maybe their future retirement. They've got a different set of needs.
Yeah, they are well and truly squeezed in the coming decade. So for the Gen Xers in the room, you are facing the toughest decade probably, because you still have financially dependent kids right now. So even if they are already out of the house at uni or in education, they might still rely on you financially. You soon have aging parents that will need your help, be this financially, be this through care, be this by providing them a spare bedroom in the dwelling as well. So there is a lot of squeeze on Gen X at the moment. The good news, if you will, is that pretty much on the same day, in about a decade, your kids will be out of the house, financially independent, and your parents will have died. This means you have no financial and time burden with your parents, and you might even get an inheritance. So in about 10 years' time, the worst is, from that perspective, is done for Gen X. But in the coming decade, Gen X will have it very, very tough as well, particularly because right now would be the time where Gen X would be considered upgraders. So people that move from the current home to the biggest family home that they will ever occupy. And of course, an expensive market. You're right now being squeezed financially very much. So the upgrader market might be a bit smaller in Australia in the coming decade than it would have been in the past, simply because it's too hard for Gen X to pull this off.
Well, you talked about the wealth transfer just a moment ago, and it's well known that there's going to be somewhere between $4 and $6 trillion expected to be passed down over the next 15 years. This great wealth transfer as the baby boomers are retiring, but many are already starting to give it now with a warm hand rather than a cold hand from the grave by helping their children or their grandchildren into the housing market. The Bank of Mum and Dad has become quite a big thing, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And the Bank of Mum and Dad, we praised it on this podcast before, is the best thing a family unit can do, because it gives your money stays within the family. It gives the younger generation a massive leg up over the competition that are the not asset rich families. And I often talked about a mortgage being a poverty penalty, meaning because you're not rich enough to pay the house in cash, you need to pay a lot of money to the bank. And if you were to pay a mortgage at 5.3% over 30 years, you pay exactly twice the money that the bank gives you back to the bank. So a $500,000 mortgage is $1 million that you pay to the bank. At the moment, it's a bit more expensive, but it could roughly work out this way. So this means if your parents manage to give you $100,000 and they actually make sure that you give $200,000 less dollars to the bank. So you're doubling the bang for the buck. It is fantastic. So if you have intergenerational money available, use it. That's the advice that you give on a family-to-family basis. On a societal basis, you'd say, well, is this fair? Probably not. probably means that if your parents aren't asset rich, tough luck.
It's creating a bigger divide, isn't it, Simon, between the property owners and those who don't have it?
Exactly, which is why property is so important. And we can make all the arguments whether this should be the case or this should not be the case. But you live in the real Australia that you live in right now. And so it go, well, becoming part of this property bonanza here is actually helpful for the family unit. And being away is quite risky because we do know from endless reports that the best indicator that you do not end up in poverty in old age is owning a property. That's the most important thing because it is the biggest spending factor is your household costs. And if you pay down your mortgage, your housing costs are pretty small. Yes, you pay 1% of the value per house for maintenance costs or something like this. That's all right. But if you still have to pay rent or a mortgage in your retirement years, that is a big fat chunk of your income, of your wealth.
Well, a trend that's become more popular over the last couple of years to get into the housing market, because I agree with you that the sooner you get in, the easier it's going to be. I don't know anyone who has said, I regret not getting in early. This new trend is really rent vesting, the concept of renting where you want to live in the lifestyle area, the amenities area you want to live, but can't necessarily afford to buy, but then buying a property somewhere where you can afford to. From a demographic standpoint, this is something reasonably new compared to in my generation when the focus really was on buying your home first. I think this is a trend that's going to continue, Simon.
It's because if you look at where the high income young earning population lives, which is relatively close to the city centers, it's very expensive to purchase. It's also expensive to rent, but it is cheaper to rent than to have the mortgage. And so you go, well, if I can pay the rent and I buy a property somewhere else, the mortgage repayments are smaller than the difference between what it would be to have a mortgage in the place that I'm renting. That's the way to get in there.
It also makes a lot of the costs tax deductible. The insurance, the mortgage is tax deductible, the strata fees is tax deductible. So rent money isn't necessarily dead money as long as somebody else is paying you an equivalent amount, and some of the outgoings are now going to be a little bit easier for you to hold.
Yeah, and so we will see a growth of that, to be honest. And if we add more and more apartments to the mix, which is another discussion whether this will be the case or not. But so if there are more apartments out there, you'll have more relatively cheap investment properties out there to purchase. And so this will become easier to find the suitable project for you.
Simon, I'd like to ask you a question about advising policymakers, but before I do, I know in your day-to-day job you do advise policymakers, you also advise institutions, organisations, and even down to businesses as a co-founder of the demographics group. Clearly, you're showing in these weekly podcasts your experience on this. Maybe you could just explain what you do and how you can help industry or businesses who'd love to have your services.
So, well, we look deep into the demographic crystal ball, trying to understand what's coming up. And forecasting demographics only a decade into the future, for example, is very easy, particularly in Australia, a country that just dictates the migration intake, a country where we have a clear understanding of birth rates, of death rates, very stable, reliable trends. So we can look with big amount of certainty into the future. And we can then say, well, if those demographic trends continue and we have people of certain specific values, generational values, move into another stage of the life cycle, what might this mean for your product? Is your product in more demand, in less demand? Is your customer base, are they changing values? Does it mean you need to change the way you communicate with them? Or, of course, we look at this from a staffing perspective. Does your staff all of a sudden care about new things? And do you then need to adjust accordingly there? And and all of this feeds together in coherent narratives, hopefully. And that allows you to make better decisions. Always with the belief that we are selling the demographic perspective on a topic, and that if you view any topic, whatever it is, from as many perspectives as possible, you are able to make better decisions.
Well, I'll leave a link in the show notes for people to how to get into contact with Fiona as part of your team to see if your services would be a benefit to them and how they can contact you. But rather than waiting for the policymakers to contact you, if you have a chance now to actually give a recommendation, a suggestion for whoever's going to be in government, what would your recommendation be to help younger Australians not just catch up but thrive in the property markets moving forward?
Well, so we want to think about what's the role of property, and this hasn't been quite decided yet. So if you are of the opinion that property is a right, that we want to make sure that we put as many Australians in a house that they own so that we avoid poverty in old age. You would encourage policies that drive down house prices. You would make sure that there's a lot of stock available. You'd increase supply, and you would introduce policies that drive down the price. And so then you need to have all of those big discussions about, well, if we play with the big ticket item policies, will they drive down prices? Will they drive down demand? Or whatever is the question. Let's say you kill off stamp duty and introduce a land tax. Does this drive down house prices? What does it do to supply? So you always want to have those discussions. If we incentivize or de-incentivize investment properties, and what does this do to supply, to demand? You want to have those honest discussions. I, for example, am very much of the opinion that certain policies should just be killed off. Something like first home buyer grants. I'm a big opponent, because this is just giving public money to young people with the idea that they can more quickly jump on the property ladder. But all the while, you are driving up the price of the property, because the market immediately learns about the fact that you are now giving millions of dollars or billions of dollars to young people, and then the house price adjusts upwards. So that's dumb, in my opinion.
It's the fact that if you give people money, they're going to spend it. And so it's, in my mind, not a first homeowner grant, but an established homeowner boost, because all of a sudden those selling get a bonus.
That's exactly what it is. You could say, as a policymaker, if you're just a politician who wants to be elected, that's a great idea, because you still want to remember that the vast majority of Australian voters in particular live in a house that they own or have a mortgage on. And they, of course, want higher prices. And only 26% of Australian voters are renters. And so what do you care about those 26%? You need to make policies for the big majority of the...
Well, Simon, I think it was an interesting discussion. I know baby boomers got a head start, but I just want to reassure the younger generations who are listening to this or watching that you've actually got the most important asset on your side. And that's time. If you combine that with education, strategic advice, and a willingness to play the long game, your future is far from lost. And I think playing the long game's, important. I know that that's why baby boomers are ahead now, because they did play the long game and they've learned the concept of delayed gratification. Now, there's always going to be challenges, whether it's interest rates, tighter lending, affordability. But having been around the block a few times, I also know there's opportunities in our markets. You just need to know where to look and get the right team on your side. So don't complain about the rules. Yes, Simon, you and I have come up with some ideas how the rules could change. I don't think they're going to much. So learn how to play smarter and adapt, invest strategically. So if you didn't pass go in the 80s, you can still build your own path to wealth, because in real life, unlike Monopoly, you can choose your strategy, your advisors, and you can own the board that you're playing on, Simon.
Absolutely. And please always remember that when we talk about which generation had it easier, this is not meant to devalue these struggles. So if we go, millennials have it very hard today, this doesn't necessarily mean that our boomers had it easy peasy and what are you guys complaining about? That's not what this means. It's really, we always want to acknowledge the struggles that older generations did make. It doesn't say it was just easy, you give out 12 raspberries and you get a house for it or something like this. It's not that simple. People did cut back. People did make conscious decisions to do this. But everyone, every generation, every person is a product of their time and place, and you act according to whatever cards history has dealt you. And these things change decade by decade. And a couple of decades later, we are now in this particular moment of time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon. I look forward to catching up with you for our show again next week. Now, if you've watched this or listened to this and you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, each week Simon and I get together to unveil the trends shaping our future, as well as looking in the past to give us some lessons for what's ahead. So why not subscribe to the show so you get our insights each week? And if you got some benefit, a real favour you could do for us, the only favour we ever ask of you is tell somebody else about it, because that's the way our audience grows so we can keep bringing you this great content. Thanks for catching up again, Simon. Look forward to seeing you next week.
I'll see you next week, Michael.
As a way of having a little more fun on these podcasts, I'm introducing a new segment each week. It's a property trivia question where each show I'm going to ask you, my listeners and viewers, a question and give you an opportunity to win a hard copy, a real copy of one of my books, the best-selling book, How to Grow a Multi-Million-Dollar Property Portfolio in Your Spare Time. And everyone who enters the quiz is also going to get a copy of one of my special reports, which will change around to just allow you to keep answering the questions each time. I'm going to ask you the question in a moment, and then just go to propertytrivia.com.au, enter your name, and you'll be in the running for one of the books. So here's this week's question. And skyscraper friend, this is a tall one for you. Which Australian capital city is home to the tallest residential building in the country? You can also tell me the name of the tower, but that's not as important. If you think you know, go to propertytrivia.com.au, leave your message. Everyone's going to get the opportunity everyone's going to get a free report, an updated report I've just done, plus three people this week are going to get a copy of How to Grow a Multi-Million-Dollar Property Portfolio. propertytrivia.com.au. Now we're going to get on with my mindset message. Well, as you heard in my discussion with Simon a short while ago, there are still opportunities in the property market, and I see this as the beginning of the next phase of the property cycle, possibly even the beginning of what I'd call a property super cycle, a period of prolonged property growth, because we've got a combination of the Labor government's pro-housing policy, the fact that it wants us to have a big Australia at a time when we've got a chronic undersupply of properties and a construction bottleneck and builder insolvencies, meaning we're just not going to build enough properties. It's also at a time of renewed buyer confidence as interest rates are falling, and it's clear that we are entering the next phase of the property market, one where savvy investors who act early are going to ride this upswing. History shows us that others who are wondering what's happened are going to be left behind. The smart money's already on the move. So that's why I'm suggesting that you have a chat with one of the wealth strategists at Metropole to see how you can take advantage of the current stage of the property cycle. Have a complimentary wealth discovery chat. Just go to metropole.com.au. This is no obligation session where we'll show you how we can help you clarify your goals, understand how all these shifts are going to affect your position. We can help you create a personalized investment strategy and take advantage of the turning point before the market surges. So let's make sure you don't miss the next boom, because by the time most investors realize the market's turned, the best opportunities will be long gone. Go to metropole.com.au and organize your wealth discovery chat.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message with you today, I'd like to share with you, I guess, the message of the hidden cost of comfort. It's a story I read recently about a man who once watched a moth struggle to break free from its cocoon. After hours of effort, he felt sorry for it, so he gently cut the cocoon open. The moth emerged easily, but it never flew. Its body was swollen, its wings were weak, and it died grounded. The man didn't realize what this was, what happened. You see, the struggle is part of the process. The pressure of pushing through the cocoon forces fluid from the body into the wings of the moth. Without the resistance, flight is impossible. So here's the truth in this mentorship message for you today. Growth feeds on struggle. Comfort, it can actually be a cage, and avoiding pain often leads to greater suffering later. We all want transformation, but we resist the tension that brings it. We procrastinate on the big projects. We avoid a tough conversation. We skip the internal work. We run from resistance, and in doing so, we rob ourselves of our wings. So my message to you is, ask yourself, what growth are you starving by avoiding the struggle? Next time you're tempted to make life easier, whether for yourself or for someone you care about, remember the moth. The struggle isn't punishment, it's preparation. The breakthrough you're waiting for may be hiding in the discomfort you're avoiding. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. But before you move on to the next podcast you're going to listen to, let me remind you I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. We call that Demographics Decoded, where Simon and I unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. In my mind, this is a must-listen to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, but also for business people and entrepreneurs. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your podcast app where you're listening to this, or on YouTube. And of course, if you don't subscribe to this show, the Michael Yardney podcast, why not click the link that says follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. So twice a week, you're going to get benefit from my guests and me. And I'd like to ask you a little favour, please. If you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody who would also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcast, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Well, just tell them about it. Just have a chat with them. Now, I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing me a favour in my quest to help as many people as possible to become financially literate. And by the way, I've got a special bonus for you. As my way of saying thank you for subscribing, just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. It's just my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember, the information that we give you in this podcast is general information, not specific information about your personal circumstances, because we don't know about them. But if you do want specific information, you can always have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. If you really want to learn more, you can always listen to the previous podcast, the many episodes we've already published. Just go back to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael, but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?